It is 18 minutes to 11. And the Emerge Festival has been running from June the 1st and goes right on through to July 31st. And playing as part of it this Thursday is the Victorian premiere of Burmese Dreaming, a documentary by Tim Syrota. Tim has been living up on the Thai-Burma border in a place called Mae Sot. That he's been there for some time now, working in a refugee camp, and he joins us in the studio to chat about the Victorian premiere of his documentary. Thanks for coming in, Tim. This is not your first time in at Triple R. You've been in on The Breakfast Show a couple of times, and each time you have talked about something to do with Burma. So where does that come from? Where's the interest in Burma come from?
First travelling to Burma in 1997 was my first time in Burma, and that led to the writing and publication of a book and also a body of photographic work, which was pretty successful. Both in Australia and internationally. That was the beginning of a photographic career, I guess, was that body of work from Burma.
97?
97.
How hard was it to get into Burma at that time?
They'd just opened up where you could get they'd gone within the last, a couple of months before, they'd literally gone from giving tourists a 7-day visa to allowing them a 1-month visa, and then you could make an application as a student of Buddhism for a 2-month extension. So that's what I did.
And you've never looked back, really?
Never looked back.
So how long have you been living there for, and how does that work with coming back here to Australia?
Clarifying, living, as you said earlier, living on the Thai-Burma border, not inside Burma itself. Yes. Moved there in 2004, lived there full-time for 3 years, came back to Australia sort of on and off between doing the basic work, either photography or film work, then coming back for post-production in Australia, and then going back to the border, and then coming back to Australia. Then for the birth of my daughter, we were in Australia for a couple of years, and then when my daughter was 8 months old, first daughter, we moved back to the border, and we've been there for nearly 3 years again.
So living there as a family? Living
there as a family, 2 daughters, wife, myself, and yeah, that's where we're...
So what are you doing there? Why did you move there?
Originally it was to facilitate, because I shot Burmese Dreaming inside Burma. I came back to Australia, I had a book published, photography, as I was saying, did well, and I did a number of sort of lectures around Australia. So I'd shot this project inside Burma, but the next 2 years were very, very busy from a work perspective in Australia, and you sit in your sort of office and go, well, if I don't do something and take a radical step, I'm never going to produce this documentary. So that was what precipitated me going to live on the Thai-Burma border in 2004, was the desire to be in an environment which would help facilitate the making of this documentary, and also one that I could actually afford to live in for a year without necessarily drawing an income from anywhere. Burmese Dreaming was completely self-funded. And be able to work on it for an extended period of time without sitting there going, oh my goodness, I don't have an income. Yeah.
Well, the film, it's called Burmese Dreaming, as you've mentioned. It's based upon stories from the life of a Burmese refugee, Say La. And she's living in the refugee camp where...
She's resettled subsequently.
She has resettled.
So she's now happily and safely in America.
So tell us about her story. I guess I want a bit of background of what this refugee camp is like. Who are the people that are living there? Why are they there?
Contentious.
And what happens?
Contentious. Okay, traditionally, and I think so many things, there's so much change with regard to Burma, with regard to the refugee camps. The Thai saying same but different is totally applicable. But certainly over a 20-year period or 25-year period, the refugees were what you would call 100% bona fide UNHCR, UN Convention defined refugees who were fleeing a situation where either they had directly encountered human rights abuses, or there was a very real fear of that because of the ongoing conflict in Karen State over a third. Well, the conflict's been going for more than, or had been going for more than 4 decades, but certainly there was an escalation through the 80s, which led to the refugees coming into Thailand. And because of the ongoing conflict in Karen State and because of the ongoing abuses by the Burmese military through the 80s, 90s and the early 2000s, I'd say that since sort of 2005, 6, there has been a decrease in those abuses Those abuses being forced labour, burning of villages, arbitrary execution, raping of villagers, the grossest of human rights abuses that you could imagine against a minority ethnic group were occurring in Karen State over a number of decades. As I say, since 2006, 7, something like that, maybe 8, those abuses are not nearly as prevalent. Forced labour is still taking place, but in terms of the grossest abuses, they've decreased.
That's very recent, though.
It is recent.
And so what has been left? Are these people able to go back to their homes, or
no? In terms of when you look at the positive developments in Burma since the elections, and specifically more recently, and with Aung San Suu Kyi free to travel, and the focus that she's tried to put in her travels, both her time in Thailand when she came out of Burma for the first time, and the fact that she chose to go straight up to the refugee camps, shows very clearly, I think, her perspective on the need to not forget Burmese migrants and refugees, and the importance that she gives to that. So in that context, I think she's doing very well. I mean, she's doing brilliantly to keep them on the international agenda at a time when funding is being cut to the border, significantly, international funding. All international funding is to go into Burma. Everyone wants to fund projects in Burma now, which could potentially be problematic. It's good in one way, but it could sort of lead to something like the sort of massive funding that went into Cambodia in the 90s, which just became a trough for corruption.
We were talking about foreign aid just before on the show, and so much of it is intrinsically linked with people movement and how that actually gets doled out, I guess, and whether it's done well. Yes,
and also politics. Yeah. So anyway, so with regard to the refugees, what we just them going back, main issues: heavily landmined area, unmapped landmine area. So if you're going to repatriate 150,000 people, primarily Karen people, back into Karen State, you have to look at the fact that it's been a conflict zone where most of the mines are unmapped, and it's one of the most heavily mined areas in the world. So that's problematic. You have to look at the fact that some of these people have been away from their villages for 20 or 30 years. Some of them are second or third generation who don't actually have village. They've never lived anywhere but the refugee camp.
And so it's whole generations, whole families.
Absolutely.
Of people
Where do they
living
go
in
back
these
to? They
camps.
don't actually have a place in Burma. They've never been there. They don't have a house or a village that they came from. They came from a refugee camp. They were born into that. So repatriating them to what? To where? I mean, there are sorts of industrial zones set up inside Burma specifically for these people to go back to. I mean, that
I
sounds
know you
a bit...
can't speak for everyone, but do you get the impression that people do want to return to Burma?
Definitely.
Right.
I think there's no doubt about that, and I have to agree with your earlier, Pamela speaking. It's a gross misconception, and it's sort of arrogant to think, all these people want to come to Australia because we're such a good country. We're a fantastic country, I have no doubt, but they love their culture. They like traditionally the Burmese, they like to sit in tea shops and that's essentially the Burmese equivalent of a pub, and sit around and talk for hours. They like to go to the temple. They like their festivals. The only reason some of these refugees have really wanted to resettle to third countries, you talk to almost all of them, and it's for the benefit of their children. It's not for their own desire. They would like to go back to their own country, and if they saw an opportunity to do so, and one where they were convinced that, their own background of abuse, human rights abuse, was not going to come up again. There is an issue. I mean, if you send them back, there's the mining and there are property issues, as I was talking about. But there's also the legitimate fear that essentially the same military who were there perpetrating these abuses, even under the new guise and the new government, they're still the same people in charge. And they're still the same people in charge on the ground in Karen State, in Shan State, in Chin State, which, I mean, that creates a very legitimate fear for people when you say, we're going to send you back to your home.
Well, there's no doubt that this year has been an immensely important year for democracy in that country, and that's been sort of lauded the world round. But can you tell us what that feels like? You know, you just mentioned there's still that fear of the people that are in power and so on. How much on a knife's edge is this in her Nobel lecture that Aung San Suu Kyi gave? She encouraged a cautious optimism about what was happening in Burma. Do you feel like it's still on a knife's edge, really?
From a personal perspective, and I can only speak from a real personal perspective, is I think it's actually more positive than that. There are huge issues that need to be dealt with, and they're monumental issues. But I think it's almost, Aung San Suu Kyi's also talked about it not being an irreversible process yet, but you sort of get the impression that it is. You couldn't foresee, it would be hard to foresee the military taking steps to silence Aung San Suu Kyi in the future, or to lock her up or anything like that. And not being able to do that, she's such a force, and she's such a force within Burma, and she's such a force internationally, that you can't really see her taking a backward step, and it's hard to see what the military can do about that now. Touch wood. That's trying to take it off.
We're touching every piece of wood in the
studio.
Has it surprised you that this has actually happened?
Yes.
I think so many people just really thought that, and particularly after the terrible natural disasters that happened, and that closed door policy in Burma, when people wanted to go and help, and there was still this distrust from the government there, to only a couple of years later, this now.
And even before Cyclone Nargis, there was the Saffron Revolution, and that was a time which only 3 years ago, and they were shooting monks on the streets. So it's not that long at all.
Can a country move so fast?
Well, yes, I think they can. I've always said, or always thought, because if you look at Indonesia and Suharto, and you look at the Philippines and Marcos, 1 year before you couldn't have predicted those the toppling or the falling of from power of those leaders, because they seemed so omnipotent and so sort of unshakable.
Well, so central. It was all them.
Absolutely. But then they just they collapse at some point. They collapse, and the Burmese military's been there since '62, so it's a heck of a long time, and that can lead to a lot of disillusionment. But you sort of got the impression that when it would come, it might not be in a foreseeable way. It might not be because of a specific sort of demonstration or process of revolution or anything like that. Just some sort of, and I'm sure it's economic. It is economic. It's the desire for corrupt and rich people to try and get richer.
Well, there's so many different areas to talk about. One thing you talked about was people wanting a better life for their families, and this is happening, of course, around the world, but particularly in the refugee camp that you're living in. Education is talked about in your film, Burmese Dreaming, as being appalling in Burma. Do you have hope that the NGOs and the money that is going to begin to pour into Burma can be funneled into those sort of areas? Do you see that happening?
I have no doubt. It will definitely go into those areas. I think when you look at something like specifically education, Burma has a rich tradition of respect for education. Under British colonial time, there was a British education system imposed on Burma, but it was one which I think fell in line with a part of the Burmese character that they appreciated it, they liked it. It's a sophisticated intellectual culture. I think that's a very fair assessment of it. It's got a history of satire, it's got a history of literature, it's got all of these sort of more erudite forms of the arts. Burma has a cultural history of those. The respect for education in Burma, even under the military when it was so suppressed, and it was one of the most suppressed education systems in the world, where, for example, if you close down all tertiary education in a country for 12 years, or the best part of 12 years, and that's a military policy, that was the approach of the military. But even through that, the Burmese still have this absolute respect for teachers, and teachers in Burma are rated as one of the highest sort of in terms of social status. If you're a teacher, you're up there with you're higher than lawyers. You're up there with doctors.
I should say that should happen everywhere, Tim. As I'm not sure how aware you've been of the fight in Victoria for teachers' rights. It's incredibly frustrating in a country like Australia that we're still treating teachers as lower paid citizens in our world. But I mean, we are talking about Burma. It's been kind of. Is it hard to decipher what's actually happening in Burma, being so close to it, when it has been such a closed country for such a very long time?
For me personally, it's because you have to look at Burma in terms of it's not homogenous, and in terms of what's happening, it's not sort of what's happening in central Burma with regard to ethnic Burman populations. You have to draw lines, unfortunately, and those lines can be drawn along ethnic bases. I mean, we see what's going on with the Rohingya at the moment. So in terms of, are they having positive developments?
Let's just for a second, let's talk about that, because I think a lot of Australians might not know what's going on there. There is still quite a bit of conflict in Burma. And how is that affecting sort of what you do and where you're living?
It's remote. As I say, I mean, you divide Burma up. The fact that the conflict between the Kachin people, you have to think in terms of multi-ethnic diversity in Burma. So the Kachin in the north still have a conflict with the Burmese military, which is at this time still unresolved. So there are still people being killed in an armed conflict in the north of Burma. That's something which needs to be resolved. On the northwestern border, you have the issues to do with the Rohingya people, who are probably the single most, well, they are, no, not probably, they are definitely the single most marginalised group inside Burma. Amongst, they're Muslim, they're traditionally from Bangladesh, but that's dating back 200 years. They've been living in Burma for 2 centuries. Burmese people, by and large, do not like these people. So even pro-democracy organisations will have a very hard line towards Rohingyas as not being recognised as Burmese people. It's a sad situation. I mean, they're the bottom of the bottom in a very difficult country. And
it has been. What has Aung San Suu Kyi said about it? Them?
Yeah, softly.
Right.
She's not said, other than saying that conflict issues need to be resolved and laws need to be addressed. She's not actually come out. I don't think she's actually even come out and said the word Rohingya. Specific. I might be wrong on that.
There are some conspiracy theorists who believe that some of this conflict that's happening in Burma has been sort of orchestrated to disrupt what's happening, the democracy that's happening in Burma at the moment, to put it off the rails.
Yeah, no, again, it's personal, but I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, the Rohingya situation is one that's been there for decades. So the potential for it to flare up at any given time has been
a given.
So yes, maybe it has been. It could be a conspiracy. Certainly the Burmese military traditionally have done things like that. They've planted bombs and exploded them themselves. But this is going back years now. I mean, last time I was in Burma, they did that in Mandalay Market, and word on the street literally was everyone knew it was the Burmese military. And similarly, they've shot monks. And so,
how does a country that's been so entrenched with distrust, I guess, for such a long time, see the other side of that?
I think that's going to be immensely difficult. Even now, if Aung San Suu Kyi says something, then it can be like it can be misconstrued, and then all of a sudden an organisation which is totally pro-democracy will get sort of feel that she's excluding them or something, and then they get worried about it. And mistrust is, and that's decades of living under a different regime to sort of wipe that out through sort of generational development. Complicated.
Complicated, but it has been an amazing step forward. And you were sort of talking before about how it was going to happen. It did sort of seem to happen, I think, with a lot of fanfare, which was great. It was talked about. It didn't just it was like, this is what is going to happen, and we will do it. And the elections happened, and it happened.
It did.
I don't know. I'm
don't
sort of
really
thinking
want
it's
to.
not.
I don't
Sometimes
really
it
want
becomes.
to credit the Burmese military, but they've always said that they've had this roadmap for democracy and whatever. And you go, well,
Did they really?
okay,
Yes.
yeah. Well, look, yeah, highly cynical on that one, but they did sort of put it out there. Yes.
Well, you have created this incredible documentary, which basically just is a beautiful testament to the stories that come out of the refugee camp where you've been living. How does it feel to actually have put the final cut together for this from this documentary?
Yeah, look, because it's been a long process. Part of you guys, well, I'm really glad that that's done now, and let's move on. But by the same token, it sort of sounds a bit egocentric and whatever, but I really like the way that I've approached it. And sorry if that does sound sort of.
Go ahead.
You have to be.
Go ahead.
You have
No
to
one's
be pleased
listening,
with. You have to be pleased with your work and all that sort of thing, and to have taken a sort of a different approach and an artistic and creative approach to a subject where usually it's so interview driven and it's so sort of fact driven, and if anything the documentary has been criticised because it doesn't really give you facts. It tries to be simple. It tries to it's almost like the girl herself is telling you the story, and in trying to communicate to people you try to do that by arousing appropriate emotion rather than.
It's senses. I think is a good word for it. It's you get a feeling of the smell and the touch and the sounds and the place of where these people live. And I do understand, like, if you don't approach this documentary and come away from it with facts and so on, but so much is known about Burma anyway that it's actually nice just to hear some stories. I think.
I think you see on television, I've always sort of felt this, you see on television so much of the horror, like you see Biafran children and you see sort of the famines and the war-torn streets of the Middle East and so on and so forth. Sometimes I think by showing that, you distance yourself from an audience because that reality is so far removed from when you're sitting in Melbourne or you're sitting in... that you can't actually appreciate it on a human level because you can't say, oh, that's something like in my life or whatever. What you try and do through in this film, through, say, the nature of the imagery, through the nature of the stories, through the music, through whatever, is something where you can actually go, oh, that's a bit like something in my life. So you have a much more human bond with the character, and you go, oh, look, this is a human being sort of like me, who loves football, despite everything, or who has a pet that happens to be a water buffalo, not a dog. But anyway, so you try.
Well, I think we could all value from a bit of that empathy at the moment in Australia, Tim. Yeah. We have been talking to Tim Syrota about Burmese Dreaming, a documentary that he has created. It is going to be playing as part of the Emerge Festival's Film and Arts Festival. That festival goes for quite a long time. Your film is going to be played this Thursday, the 5th, at Treasury Theatre, and I think there's going to be a Q&A with that.
There is a question
with
and
you,
answer.
so you better be ready with some answers there. So Treasury Theatre, but check out multiculturalarts.com.au. Just Google Emerge Festival and you'll find all the information there. It's a great program. It's a long program, so there's quite a bit to see. Tim, thank you so much for heading on back into Triple R to talk about the fabulous stuff you've been doing. And we look forward to the next conversation, I think.
A pleasure.